Ever get that feeling, when you look at someone's picture and you just feel like you know them, like their story is right there in their eyes? Well, today we're diving into a case where a young woman's life, it was tragically cut short. And sadly, her story got all tangled up in, well, a whole mess of unanswered questions.
The thing about this case, the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer back in 2005 in Russellville, Arkansas, is that it went through 3 trials. 3. And even after all that, it's still unsolved.
Yeah, and we're going to try and unravel this whole thing for you today. We've got court transcripts, interviews, and even another podcast that did a deep dive on this one called, get this, Murder in Apartment 12.
And as we go through it all, it really shows you how much the human element, all the messy stuff, really affects how justice is served, or in this case, isn't.
Right, right. So let's start at the beginning with the initial suspect, Nona's boyfriend at the time, Kevin Jones.
So the police, Detective Mark Frost in particular, they really zeroed in on Kevin right away. And the interrogation transcripts, wow, they're intense. Frost just kept accusing Kevin over and over.
I can't imagine. I mean, that kind of pressure must have been awful for Kevin and his family.
Oh, absolutely. It's important to remember Kevin's parents, they spent a fortune on his defense, even paid for DNA testing on other possible suspects.
So what happened?
Well, he was acquitted, the charges were dropped, but even so, you got to figure the suspicion, the trials, all of it, it took a huge toll.
Yeah, no kidding.
Hmm.
So then we have Gary Dunn, known as Neighbor, who also becomes a key suspect. What made him stand out?
Well, Dunn had this documented history of violence against women. Like, he'd even been convicted of assaulting a jogger. And then there was some real inconsistencies in his alibi for when Nona was killed. So that put him right in the spotlight.
Okay, so was there anything solid connecting him to the crime?
There was DNA in Nona's apartment, linked to Dunn. But even with that, 2 trials, and both ended in hung juries.
Wow. So we've got 2 possible suspects, both with their own issues, but neither convicted. But what about the investigation itself? I hear there were some problems, some real controversy with how it was handled.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets complicated. Detective Frost's actions, they really came under fire. People
Yeah.
were accusing him of maybe hiding evidence, stuff that could have helped Kevin's case or pointed more clearly at Dunn.
What kind of evidence?
Things like notes from the investigation, things that could have thrown doubt on Dunn's alibi. And there were also questions about how they handled the fingerprints, and even if the polygraph tests they gave Kevin and Dunn, if those were even accurate.
That sounds like a real mess.
It was. The Jones family even sued Crossed in the city, Russellville, because of all this.
And what happened with the lawsuit?
Dismissed. They missed a deadline, which, just adds insult to injury.
Yeah, no resolution for the family there. And then, this is crazy, years after Nona's murder, there's another incident with Gary Dunn.
This is a chilling part of the story. A woman, Amber Duay, she's working at Walmart, and she has this terrifying encounter with a guy. And she identifies him later as Gary Dunn.
Wait, wasn't Dunn in prison by then?
He had been, but he was out on parole.
So even with his history, his connection to Nona's case, he's just walking around free.
Yep, sadly he was. And this encounter with Amber Duay, it leads to new charges: attempted kidnapping, indecent exposure.
Wow. That must have shaken everyone up.
Oh, yeah. Big time. It showed everyone that this case, the threat from Gary Dunn, it was still very real.
Okay, so we've got this young woman murdered. Her boyfriend is the main suspect at first. Then a neighbor with this violent past, a potentially messed up investigation. And years later, another woman is targeted by the same guy. That's a lot to take in.
It is. And at the center of it all, there's Detective Frost. Even with all the twists and turns and the questions about his work on the case, he still believes completely that Kevin Jones killed Nona.
He's never changed his mind.
Nope, not at all. And next, we'll look at why he's so sure, what he sees as the proof of Kevin's guilt, and what the other side says about those claims.
It's amazing. After all the investigating, the trials, this whole thing still comes down to 2 completely opposite points of view.
Right, and it shows how complicated it is to get justice, how hard it is to see the truth when there are so many interpretations, so much human error.
This is why I love doing these deep dives. We're not just looking at the headlines, we're getting into the details, the gray areas, the unanswered questions. It's what makes these cases so fascinating. Stick with us, there's a lot more to uncover. Okay, so let's get into Detective Frost's head a little. What is it specifically that makes him so sure Kevin's guilty?
Well, Frost always brings up a few things. For one, the fingerprint. Found right at the crime scene, a bloody fingerprint on a door frame.
Bloody fingerprints, that seems like pretty open and shut, right?
You'd think so, but it's not so simple. Frost was adamant it was Kevin's print, in blood no less, but there were problems.
Problems like what?
Well, experts looked at it later and said it was too smudged to say for sure it was Kevin's. And there was even debate about whether it was even blood.
Huh. So what seemed like a slam dunk suddenly gets a lot more hazy.
Exactly. And then there's Kevin's alibi. Frost always maintained that Kevin's story about where he was when Nona died, it just didn't add up, made him suspicious.
But if that's true, why wasn't that enough to get a conviction?
Well, remember, Kevin was acquitted. The jury wasn't convinced, and a lot of that hinged on Frost's take on the alibi. The defense had witnesses, evidence, all backing up Kevin's story, going right against what Frost was saying.
Okay, so we've got a fingerprint that's up in the air and an alibi that's contested.
Yeah.
Anything else Frost is hanging his hat on? You mentioned gut feeling earlier.
Yeah, and this is where things get tricky. Frost has always said he just had this feeling, this gut instinct that Kevin did it. Years on the job, he says, gave him a sixth sense, and in this case, it pointed to Kevin.
But as you said, you can't really bring gut feelings into the courtroom as evidence, can you?
You can't. It's almost impossible to argue against a gut feeling, but it doesn't hold water legally. You need proof, not just a hunch.
And it sounds like that reliance on instinct, that's at the heart of a lot of the criticism Frost got for his handling of the investigation.
Exactly. The worry is that because he was so focused on Kevin, he might have missed other clues that pointed somewhere else, maybe at Gary Dunn.
Especially with Dunn's history of violence towards women and his own iffy alibi.
Right, those are huge red flags. They should have been looked at more carefully, more objectively.
And we know Dunn was later convicted of trying to kidnap a woman in indecent exposure.
Yep, which just makes it more clear that he was a real danger to women.
So where does that leave us? A detective going with his gut, a boyfriend who's under the microscope but never convicted, and a neighbor with a scary past but no clear link to the murder.
It's a tangled mess, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like we're any closer to getting real answers about what happened to Nona. But this whole thing makes you think, how much can we trust our gut feelings when things are this complicated?
It really does make you wonder. Yeah, it makes you think, how much can we really trust those gut feelings when we're trying to figure out, well, anything, really,
Yeah.
especially something this important. We all have instincts, right? But when do they become a problem? Like in a situation where the stakes are this high?
That's the million-dollar question. In this case, it really lays it all out. Frost, he was so certain Kevin was guilty, even with all the evidence that didn't fit, and then another suspect pops up with a pretty disturbing history. It makes you wonder about how much weight we should give to intuition when we make decisions.
It feels like a textbook case of, confirmation bias. You start out believing something,
Yeah.
and then you just kind of ignore anything that says you might be wrong.
Right, you filter out the stuff that doesn't match up with what you already believe. And in a criminal investigation, when you're trying to find justice, that can have some serious consequences.
It's also just, it's sad thinking about Nona's family, everyone who loved her, not knowing what really happened, all these unanswered questions, and the thought that the person who did this might still be out there. That's got to be a heavy weight to carry.
Absolutely. There's no closure. The family's dealing with the loss, the trauma. And then on top of it all, this uncertainty, this feeling that justice wasn't served.
Man, this deep dive, it's been a wild ride. We started with what seemed like a simple murder, but the more we dug in, the more complicated it got.
We had suspects, a controversial investigation, accusations of hidden evidence, possible biases, and then on top of that, the fact that the violence didn't end with Nona's murder.
It's amazing how instinct, evidence, human error, they all come together and shape how an investigation goes, and in the end, whether justice is served or not.
It shows that even the justice system, which is supposed to be fair and accurate, it's still run by people.
Yeah.
And people make mistakes. They have biases.
It's a sobering thought. And it makes you wonder how we all approach information, how we form opinions. When should we trust our gut? When do we need more than just a feeling? How do we even recognize when we're being biased? It's something to think about, not just with true crime, but in life in general.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we need to think critically. We need to question our assumptions and maybe be a little skeptical, especially in this day and age where there's so much information out there, but not all of it's true.
So, to sum it all up, we explored the murder of Nona Dirksmeer, a case that's still unsolved. We looked at the suspects, the investigation, and the impact it's had on everyone involved.
We saw how gut feelings can drive decisions, how biases can affect judgment, and how sometimes, even after all that work, there's still no clear answers.
It's a reminder that even when things seem simple, there can be a lot going on underneath the surface. The truth isn't always easy to find. But by digging into the details, having these conversations, and asking the tough questions, we can get a better understanding of ourselves, the systems we live in, and the world around us.
And maybe, just maybe, by doing that, we can help make the world a little bit more just, a little bit more fair.
Well said. And that brings our deep dive to a close for today. We hope you found it insightful, maybe a little challenging, and definitely a reminder that real life can be a lot more complicated than it seems. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging for deeper understanding.
And don't forget, sometimes the most important questions are the ones we don't have easy answers for. They're the ones that make us really think and wrestle with the complexity of, well, being human.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That wraps up our deep dive for today. Make sure to join us next time for another look into a real-life story that will leave you thinking.